Today I'm going to be talking a bit about bushing pivot systems in Balisongs, how they work, what the function of this bushing is. Spoiler alert, it is not to dissipate friction, as you'll see for yourself in a moment. And when I was first getting into this hobby, I found bushing pivot systems to be kind of mysterious, partly because there's so many parts involved. There's your bushing, there's your blade, there's your washers, there's your handle, there's your pivot and your screw. And trying to figure out how it all worked together, what exactly was going on. Was the blade rotating around the bushing? Was the bushing rotating around the pivot? Were the washers rotating inside the handles? I didn't really understand what was going on, and while there were a handful or a very small number of YouTube videos explaining what was happening, they weren't much help to me. And it wasn't until fairly recently that I really solidified my understanding. So what I figured I would do today is sort of show you, not tell you, but show you with this sort of crude visual model exactly how this whole system works. Now, this is a bushing. The bushing has three measurable dimensions. It's got an outer diameter when you're looking at it at the circle, so the outer diameter from the outside of the circle to the other side of the outside of the circle. The inner diameter, which is the same thing for the inside of the circle. And then it's got a height, which is basically how thick it is when looked at from the outside, from here to here. Okay? And that's the height, is, by the way, is what you'll be manipulating when you're trying to tune your bushing. But we'll get to that a little bit later. Now, pretty simply, the way the bushing pivot system works is that the bushing goes inside this hole in the blade, and it's held on either side of the blade with washers. Okay? So they're held on opposite sides of this bushing, and you can see this bushing has quite a bit of play. That's because it is a very oversized bushing, and I'll talk about what oversized means too. But basically, these washers go on either side of the blade. Then you can imagine my fingers sort of as two sides of a single handle, so like sandwich handle. And the handles push down on the washer, and the washer pushes down on the bushing, and then the blade can swing freely in between the washers around the bushing. Okay? Then what would happen is that you'd take your pivot, and the pivot would go through this hole in the handle, go through the hole in the handle, go through the washer, go through the bushing, go through the other washer, show up on the other side of the handle, and you'd screw it in tight with this screw. Now, once you screw it in tightly with this screw, the screws, the handle, the washer, and the bushing all become one solid piece. Okay? And that's the first point that I really want to make here, is that you can see for yourself that the handles are pushing down tightly on the washers, and the washers are pushing down tightly on the bushing. So that becomes one piece. Once you add the pivots and the screw to that, and you screw those down tightly into the handles, those become part of that one solid piece. And therefore, the bushing is not rotating around the pivot. Okay? Since all of this is one solid piece, the pivots, handle, washers, and bushing, really the only thing that's moving is the blade around the bushing. Okay? The bushing is not rotating around a pivot. And part of the reason that I'm pointing that out is because there's one of the things that's said in these other YouTube videos that explain this is that the function of a bushing is to dissipate friction, so that instead of just the blade rotating around the pivot, there's a bushing in between, the blade and the pivot, and therefore, the friction between the pivot and the blade is dissipated by this bushing, and that's what causes the smooth action. And as you can see for yourself, that's not the case, okay? Since the bushing and basically the bushing, washers, handles, and pivot and screw all create one solid piece. There's no rotating of this bushing around the pivot. So you might be wondering then, what is the point of the bushing? What's the point of the bushing, right? Well, the function of the bushing is pretty simple, and there's only one function. The function of the bushing is to hold the washers at a very specific distance from each other on either side of the blade. Now, why does this distance between the washers matter? Well, it's because this. If we go back to this sort of crude visual model where you imagine my fingers as the handle, they're pushing down they're pushing the washers, and the washers pushing the bushing. This blade actually has two axes of motion, right? It's rotating around the bushing, sure, but it's also has some space to wiggle up and down like this in between the washers, right? And that's what we call play. And it also creates things like tap when you have a lot of space between these washers, and this blade can wiggle a lot. Then it hits on the inside of the handle, and that's what makes the tap. And so what you want to do is basically, when you're quote-unquote tuning a bushing, right, what you're doing is you're shaving off this excess material on the outside of the bushing so that the washers get closer and closer to each other and closer to the blade without actually pressing down on the blade, right? Because if we didn't have this bushing in place and we just had washers, right? This is a washer-only pivot system where the washers are here and there's a pivot here, and you screw these washers, you screw the handles down tight against the washers. Well, if you keep pushing the handles against the washers and the washers are right against the blade, sure, it won't wiggle, but it also won't rotate freely, right? And so the whole point of having the bushing in there is so that, you know, this bushing is holding the washers apart so that they won't ever push so hard on the blade that it won't rotate freely, right? Now, if you do, let's say you're sanding, so like you're trying to sand material off of the top of this bushing to get it closer and closer to the width of the blade, right? Now, if you sand so much that the height of this bushing is now smaller than the thickness of the blade, that's called an undersized bushing, and at that point the bushing is no longer serving its function. At that point, when you have an undersized bushing inside here, it's no longer holding the washers just barely outside of the blade, right? So now you've just got a washer-only pivot system where the bushing is not holding the washers apart, the washers are making full contact with the blade, and basically now all you're trying to do is just screw them tightly enough that there's not too much play, but also keep them loose enough that the blade can rotate somewhat, right? But yeah, the whole point of the bushing system is just to keep the washers sort of infinitesimally like outside of the blade so that the blade can still rotate freely around the bushing, but it won't be able to wiggle much this way and that way. And that's how a bushing pivot system works. And that's really it. Now, a couple of points that I wanted to make towards the end. Let's say you tune this bushing perfectly. So you're sanding material off of here, you shave material off of here until you've got it at the right thickness. The washers, you put everything back together, the washers, the handles, and it's tuned perfectly. And over time, when you are flipping this Balisong, for weeks or months, you start to get some play in the blade, right? So you might be tempted, like I was when I was a beginner, to take this all out and start sanding down the bushing again, right? To try to get it tuned again. Don't do that. Okay? And if you think about it logically, like, it doesn't really make any sense. It's not like the bushing is going to magically grow thicker while you're playing with the Balisong over time. So why is it developing tap? Well, it's just because these washers are actually, they're made of phosphorus bronze, which is a very soft metal. And over time, when you play with the Balisong, the washers compress. I mean, the washers sort of shrink, right? Their thickness, they get thinner. And they get thinner in two ways. One is by compressing. Like I said, they just will squish down tighter. And also that, you know, some of the material will shave off due to the friction that the washer is making with the blade, okay? Just to point out, there's no friction between the washer and the handles, right? Because the handle is pushing against the washer solid. So the washer is not moving relative to the handle. It's only moving relative to the blade. So there's going to be friction on the blade side of the washer, and that's going to wear the material out and compress it. And therefore, so like if you have a perfectly tuned bushing and it loses its tune over time, it's not the bushing that's losing the tune, it's just the washers. And if you replace the washers, it should go back to a perfect tune, okay? The last thing I wanted to mention is just a little bit about floating washer systems, if you're curious about what those are. Now, this bushing, part of the reason that it's so huge relative to this blade is because this is actually a bushing for a floating washer system. In a floating washer system, instead of the washers holding, instead of the handles pushing against the washers and the washers pushing against the bushings, what you've actually got in a floating washer system is these washers. You can see that this hole in them is quite a bit bigger. That's because they go around the outside of this bushing. So now, when you've got these washers in place on opposite sides of the bushing, and the handle is pushing down like this, the handle is pushing directly against the bushing. Okay, so again, handle, bushing, pivots, and screws all create one solid piece. There's still no rotation of the bushing around the pivot. But now you've got some extra space between the washers and the handle and the blade. Whereas before, there was only space between the washer and the blade because the other side of the washer was pushing firmly against the handle. Now you've actually got these washers floating in that space between the handle and the blade that's being held. There's a space between the handle and the blade that's being held by the bushing, right? And that's where the washer exists. And as far as I can tell, the only real advantage that the floating washer system has is that, when you oil a Balisong or when you put lube in a Balisong, it actually fills up the gap between the washer and the blade if you have like a regular bushing system. So when you've got this floating bushing system, that oil will actually fill up the gap between the washer and the blade and also fill in the gap between the washer and the handle, and therefore it allows for a little bit more, like, you don't have to tune the bushing quite as perfectly because the oil will do more of the work. That's at least, so I don't really understand floating bushing systems as well as just regular bushing systems, but that's my understanding of what the advantage of a floating washer system is. However, I will say that, this is a floating washer system, this 7075 Kraken clone, and it doesn't sound as good as my regular bushing pivot system knives. And so that was the very last point that I wanted to make in this video, which isn't actually a point, it's more of a question for all of you, because I'm not an engineer and I'm not a machinist, I'm just a hobbyist. And the one part of bushing Balisongs that is still mysterious to me is why they make such a satisfying sound. Like what that sound is when you have a really perfectly tuned bushing Balisong and it makes that sort of glassy, ringy sound. Where does that come from? if you have the answer, if you have an idea, feel free to leave it in the comments. I know it has something to do with the handle shape because different handle shapes make different sounds. I suspect it has something to do with the thickness of the bushing, because I've noticed that my Balisongs with thinner bushings don't make as nice a sound as the ones with thicker bushings. But I really actually don't know what makes that sound so nice. So if you have some ideas, leave them in the comments. Thanks for watching.